You're listening to the Tech for Business podcast. Todd, our COO and CISO, and Nate, our Director of Cybersecurity, are back for the second part of our deep dive into incident response and recovery. They unpack the tricky balance between acting fast and investigating thoroughly, the life-saving role of backup systems, and how regulatory rules keep everything on track. This episode wraps up by focusing on continuous improvement so businesses can bounce back stronger and smarter after the next incident. Stick around and listen in.
It feels like a natural transition into that kind of containment stage and talking more about the actual people in the trenches doing the work. How do they balance this kind of need for speed and also thoughtful, compassionate approach, because again, it's somebody's business, it's somebody's livelihood, it could be customer and customer data. All of those things need to be taken into consideration, but also you have to work quickly.
Yeah, this is probably where true incident response engineers really set themselves apart, is the empathy that they can pass on, right? Is, like I said, the first thing we usually ask them is, do you have insurance? And then also, did you eat, right? Did you call your family, right? Is we're trying to hit the personal level and say, we've got you, but you need to take care of yourself, right? When it comes to the containment and the eradication, this is where the greatest conflict usually comes in, because as a business owner, you want your business operational. That's how you make money. Moving too fast is actually probably the most dangerous thing you can do in these environments, because what threat actors will do is once they get into the environment, they try and build persistence in there as well. So even after you kind of clean up the environment, if you forget something, they might just already still have access into that environment and they'll just hop right back in. It's usually what we call reverse shells. And so what we are trying to do in this containment and eradication phases is we contain the threat, which means how did they get in the first place? So usually you can figure this out pretty quick, but we are searching through either logs or kind of tracing patterns of what we see across commonalities across different systems and figuring out, okay, it looks like they came in through the VPN, right? Plenty of podcasts about that, but remove your VPNs. When you are looking at that, then great, let's turn off the VPN. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to start containing the threat to say, let's work with what we have right now, not necessarily adding new threats coming in along the way as well. So we will start isolating devices, maybe bringing down unaffected systems. That's impactful because they might be running business operations, but we're trying to prevent further lateral movement. And now let's work with just the compromised devices. Now at this point, sometimes there's tools that we can put on place that'll quickly scan the devices for known malicious activity to try and find which devices likely have malicious activity occurring on them or remote access. So we can say, okay, these ones are not allowed onto the network quite yet. Let's, maybe these other 75% of the devices look like they're clean. Let's put on some new tools to protect them from future threats. Let them back onto the network, keep it operational, but now we still have maybe the other 25% that we cannot put on. And now we need to start collecting forensics artifacts off of them. Again, this is the slow part, but that is so critical to do right. What also we're trying to do is things like, if you have an Active Directory, there's something called Kerberos tickets. There, and this is where I'm going to go slightly technical. I promise I won't go too deep. Is you have to rotate credentials in your environment. This breaks stuff, and it takes time to go rebuild, passwords and connections and everything like that. But there's something called the golden ticket in Active Directory. It's basically once you compromise that Kerberos, account, that Kerberos account is what's used to grant access in a Active Directory environment. If the threat actor is able to get that, they don't need to compromise passwords anymore. They have what they call a golden ticket. They just keep issuing themselves new ones. So we have to sit there and rotate those as well to make sure that whoever's in that environment does not maintain persistence. So that's the reason why it takes so long, is there's a lot of dependencies in an environment that have to be done right to kick everyone out. And then we can start on more of that recovery phase as well.
Yeah. I was going to ask Todd, maybe you can talk a little bit about, that balance between staying operational, and that business continuity when getting this containment. Like that decision and that conversation happening before an incident, that conversation during an incident, having that balance between what business and business owners want and what the incident actually requires.
Yeah, depending on the incident and what's going on, you may be somewhat handcuffed on what your options are. There are certain things that are going on. We referenced the St. Paul City hack recently, and just to kind of use this as an illustration of what was going on, is the city had made certain types of decisions at some point or another for whatever reason. And I'm assuming it was because they were very deliberate in how they went about it. But one of the things that they did is they separated their network in a structure that allowed them to recover certain things much faster than others. And in one of the cases, they went and put a fair amount of information and tools inside the cloud. So for example, all of the resident information was all cloud-based. And so when they had their incident, it was all localized. It didn't impact their cloud environment. It allowed them to recover that piece incredibly quickly. They went through the review. They went and looked to see, is there anything going on? And when you find out you don't have anything to contain or eradicate, it allows you to recover incredibly quickly. So this kind of largely gets back to the conversation about, did you do your planning? Did you do your testing, et cetera, that we talked about long before, but also setting up your infrastructure in a very thoughtful manner. Nate kind of mentioned this earlier too, but as you're kind of looking at it, he didn't say it this way, but I'll use the phrase, there is a lot of technical debt that ends up getting put into a lot of places. Is I've invested heavily on this. I'm now locked into this, if you will, locked for the next 5 years, or I can't make that shift. Well, you probably can. We were using numbers for the cities that have had similar events, and you're talking millions of dollars. And if you're looking at mitigating millions of dollars of risks, you usually have a fairly good flexibility on how you get there. I know I'm a little off of the way that I answer it, but if you have a bad enough situation that is all localized and everything is local, you're kind of in a bad spot. So just to kind of highly illustrate that, Nate got into Active Directory and whatnot. If you're that deep into it, you may be rebuilding your core infrastructure from scratch or restoring it. And that means that every critical asset that you have, customer facing, financial, et cetera, that all is now second level, because you got to get your infrastructure back in place before you can start to get to the things that are quote unquote meaningful or the money makers. So the biggest way to mitigate that risk is pre-planning.
Yeah. Speaking of the pre-planning, is your business continuity disaster recovery tasks are critical, right? And this is where I think I see some of the biggest failures is their backups. Everyone assumes I have backups, right? I can pull from the backups, but what's often not looked at is how fast can I pull from the backups? How fast can I virtualize my infrastructure? Is my backup appliance big enough to virtualize all the servers that I actually need all at once? So I will pick on 3 quick incidents that I've worked on in the past. One of them, I believe I mentioned, was a warehouse company. So Todd had mentioned rebuilding your network from scratch. The very first ransomware incident I ever worked on, they had a hard drive plugged into the back of the server. This is a end-of-life 2003 server, right? They didn't invest in IT in the first place. They had a lot of technical debt. As the ransomware was going, it was encrypting their actual backup as well. It stopped 2 folders short of their entire customer database. But the server was completely encrypted. They were only backing up files, not system level stuff. So in that environment, we had to completely rebuild the entire environment from scratch and then just basically import their customer database. That was the only way that they stayed afloat. Probably the biggest incident that I've worked on in the past was a multi-million-dollar organization had ransomware. and they had good backups, but the problem was they said, we need about 10 servers spun up immediately because they all are interdependent on each other to be able to communicate and make data flow for our business. The problem was that their backup solution, they only ever accounted for disk space. So while they had all the servers backed up, they could not virtualize the environment fast enough to be able to run all 12 or 10 or 12 servers. We said,
Mhm.
you can get 2 or 3, right? Depending on how big of a server you need. Like, no, I need 12. It's like, okay, we'll start restoring, but that led to the additional downtime. They were losing over 6 figures an hour, right? It was that critical. So their total incident cost them millions of dollars, and they could have been up fairly quick had they just had a right-sized backup to be able to virtualize servers. On the good side, I have worked with, let's say, a bank here in the Twin Cities that they called in, hey, we have ransomware. Great, let's hop into your backup system. We virtualized all their servers. So they got hit with ransomware at 4 a.m., noticed it, called in around 6 a.m. We had the entire environment up and running in a virtualized state by 7 a.m. And customers walked in through the front door at the teller line at 8, never knew the difference. The full restores were underway. Insurance was already notified, but they had zero impact to the operations. And it was all due to properly spec'd backups. So you need to know what you have, how many are required, and the dependencies on those, and the order that they need to be restored on as well. And I'm sure I forgot something because Todd wants to chime in.
Yeah, I'm going to add one little thing to that. While Nate said it was all because of the great backups, it wasn't all because of that. That was because the whole incident plan worked, right? It existed and it all works out. Just to clarify, it wasn't one silver bullet that made it happen. I don't want anybody to think, well, if I just have really good backups, I'm good. It's a bit more than that.
Definitely. Moving into this next stage, because they all sort of bleed together, it's hard to be like, we're in this stage, but this eradication, I was thinking, and this is probably a little bit on the containment part too. On a different podcast, we talked about if in case of fire, break glass, the city of St. Paul ended up calling in the National Guard. In your incident response, at what point are you calling in a third party, whatever that is, like FBI, National Guard, obviously different types of industries have different resources, but what are those trigger points in an incident?
Yeah, it's a great question. I was trying to figure out when to put this in, but hopefully in your plan, you've got a fairly decent idea what your capabilities are. So smaller organizations, for example, when you're heavily reliant on one person, it's probably relatively evident that you're not going to be able to do everything. And so you've probably already have a partner on the top of your mind. We have customers that don't work with us a ton, but when things go sideways, I was going to use different terminology there. When things go sideways, they still reach out to us and say, hey, we need help and we need it now. So more often than not, there is something like that. If you do have a plan, it should already be noted in that. So I'll use the city of St. Paul as an example. The fact that they were so quick to elevate it to the National Guard, they got to a point where they reviewed what happened and they already knew we can't handle this. And part of our plan is to contact the Guard. So that was already in their plan, which again, in my opinion, is you really got to figure out how to do that. And so this to me gets back to the testing piece, right? So one of the very first times I did incident response at CIT, oddly enough, falls very heavily into the backup recovery that Nate was talking about. Was we were talking about it, how we were going to recover. And I wanted to quickly illustrate, well, how fast can we recover? How many servers are we doing? And we immediately identified, oh boy, this recovery is going to take us weeks. And we immediately pivoted, we changed our backup routine, et cetera. The fact that we practiced that one thing in particular allowed us to quickly address what the problems were. So to me, the easiest way to do it, again, gets back to practicing. So unfortunately, we're going to keep talking and hammering on this response plan and tabletop exercises because they're critical to the whole process. I feel like I've talked a lot, so I'll zip it for the short term, but that's my fast answer, quote unquote.
And I think you're right. The incident response plan should dictate all that. And one of the big things I'd also want to call out is the 72-hour reporting rule. So I'm not going to go into every industry, but if you are regulated, you should know this by now, is many regulations are now starting to mandate that within 72 hours of some type of material data breach or some type of incident that may impact the data within your industry, there's a 72-hour reporting rule. So that means that you have to report it up to that governing body saying, we have some type of incident. Maybe you don't have the full scope of it yet, but you have to at least notify them. So very, very critical thing there. Again, if you have insurance to be able to help out, that should be your first call, right? Is at least notify them that we have something developing. I don't know the full scope yet, but that's where those insurance companies have the broader connections with the legal counsel, the forensics firms, incident response firms, whatever it may be, to at least figure out where to go. And then at least you can start tapping on, funds if necessary. So.
Mm-hmm. So keeping in this kind of stage, what are some of the biggest challenges that businesses are facing when they're trying to when they're at that removal part of the incident?
Yeah, I think Nate covered a ton of this when we were talking about containment, but it tends to be that persistence, right? It's that how deep does this go? One of the first things they're going to try to do is they're going to put a back door in place to make sure that it can get back in. So finding all of those pieces and all that is one of the big ones. We're fairly deep into this, is assuming there's an external threat, but some of the other challenges that potentially were out there is if it was an insider threat, that changes things a lot. And we haven't talked about that a whole bunch. And I know we're pretty far into the podcast already, so I won't try to open up the full can of worms. I'll just crack it a little bit. But that does change things, right? You get into a much deeper legal conversation. You bring in HR into those situations, and you really have to then start to dig in and say, okay, well, if it was an insider, what did they have access to? When did they access it? And again, it's just it opens up a huge different type of challenge, but there is absolutely a lot that goes with that as well.
I have kind of a joke here at CIT of, I don't look at the logs unless you make me look at the logs, right? Is IT in most systems these days have heavy logging. So if someone is abusing something, you will be able to find out with enough time and effort of reviewing for the most part.
Not most behaviors typically picked up too.
Yeah. One of my favorites was two partners at a legal firm. One was trying to steal customers to start up his own firm and took their file share and started emailing himself all the documents, sent it all out, went into Microsoft and permanently deleted all his sent items and removed them from the recycle bin as well. Microsoft logs all that activity, just for full disclosure for anyone that didn't know that. So it's very easy to tell when you're trying to hide your activity. Additionally, they also had an email archiver that took a copy of all the emails going out. And so when we got called in saying, I think one of my partners is stealing data, I just went into there and, well, here's all the logs showing him trying to hide his activity. And here's all the emails that he sent to his Gmail address. And one strongly worded letter from one lawyer to another said, you will bring in your computer by noon today. The device showed up by noon that day. So,
oh my goodness. I want to be conscious of our time, and we still have a couple things to get through. So I'm going to move on to the recovery part. And everyone's question is like, how long does it take? Obviously, it depends. And we touched on this a little bit last week, but how long is this recovery going to take? How long is my business going to be down?
It really does depend. I mean, Nate kind of highlighted it pretty well, where he had both extremes on his two examples. One was weeks, another was hours. We recently had another one where they had a very similar backup situation. They relied heavily on SAN snapshots, but they recovered in a day and a half. It was pretty remarkable. And they were a little bit unique. They had a superstar that took care of the majority of the heavy lift for them. But the answer is it really does depend. And this gets back again to the planning, the testing. I don't want to focus so much on the tabletop on this one, because I think you do absolutely need to make sure that you're testing and make sure I got clean backups. They're immutable, all the things that we've talked about in the past. But testing that you can actually physically recover from. So at least annually, if you're in a heavily regulated industry, you should be doing, and you're pretty much required to. You'll want to test, can I fail back over if I need to? Can I do a physical restore
Mhm.
if I need to? And again, that mind process of going, how fast do I want to? But the other piece that I'll put into it is you got to recover the things that are critical first. And the organization needs to agree on that. That's not somebody in HR saying, well, I got to have the HR thing back up and running because I'm in HR and therefore it's the most important,
Yeah.
or finance or anybody else. And so the group has to come back and say, yes, but if we can't do X, Y, and Z, is that not more important? And then you can quickly prioritize. Again, I use that city of St. Paul example where they said the most important thing for us is the residents. So we're going to behave like this. That was their most critical and allowed them to get that piece back up and running almost instantly.
Yeah. I think that's a big thing, was defining what's critical to you to keep things operational. And the one other consideration I'd say is if it impacts external, customers or firms or anything like that, what are the things that are critical for them? So we are an
Mhm.
IT provider. I hope the day never ever comes of, let's say CIT was compromised and let's say we pushed ransomware out to all of our customers, right? Worst day of my life if that ever happens. But things like, what are the critical things we need to restore? Is it the customers that bring us the most money, or is it something like hospitals and police departments? And, if we're working with city water, and things like that, right? It is critical to save a hospital maybe before our own financial outcomes, because that actually impacts lives, right? And so
Mhm.
it's very critical to define those things because, I'm sure if that day ever came where happened, we will have our top 1, 2, 3 customers come to us and say, I give you X amount of money every year. I demand to be in front. I'm
Mhm.
sorry, right? Like I have to save the quote unquote lives first before.
Yeah, and I know we're going long, but I don't want to minimize this piece either. But also, what I would consider part of recovery is the people. So the people that are going through this, they're almost certainly at this one I mentioned recently where we had a group recover in a day and a half. That individual was getting about 6 hours of sleep a night. And while he was living off of that, at some point he needs to recover. So he also falls into that category, or she. And then there's also what it takes to do recovery of any kind of to your organization's reputation. So in the event that that happens, you've got to have a plan for that too. I will say a handful of years ago, the Bricata example was at that point when people were having incidents, you would talk to most people and say, hey, in the event something like this happens, what would you do? The answer almost always was stop doing business with that organization. And kind of a weird side effect is since it happens so frequently, you don't really hear that as much. But I think people are starting to understand that when they did have the event, their ability to recover is now stronger than it was before. And so it's not that they're worse and they're a terrible company. It's that they did probably the last piece here is the lessons learned and how do they apply to it.
What are the most important questions when you come back together? We've gone through this journey. We're sitting back down to review our plan or create our plan, What questions do you ask yourself when all of this is said and done?
The big thing for me, I'll give credit where credit's due, is it came from a Mandiant executive. For anyone that doesn't know it, Mandiant, they were acquired by Google, but they are the forensics firm that gets called in on most of the national level data breaches. So truly, I would say the experts when it comes to incident response. And one of their executives once told me the best way to prevent future incidents is to focus on the prevention failures that occurred in the last incident. So
Right.
again, we'll just focus on kind of that ransomware or external threat actor for now, just because it's easy to talk about. Is how did they get in? Was it the VPN? And then how did they actually be able to run the malicious software on the environment, right? Is you have multiple prevention failures that led to that ultimate incident. So, okay, let's kind of backtrack. We had a ransomware. How do we get notified it? Well, all the devices were encrypted, right? Did we receive any alerts? No. okay, there's a prevention failure. Maybe we needed EDR or some type of monitoring tool to slow things down and notify like a SOC team to monitor and respond to those. Okay, how did they actually run malicious software in the first place? Well, we didn't have any type of application allow listing solution in place. Great. Had we had something like that, the malicious software never would have been able to run. Okay, but someone still got into the environment in the first place. How? Well, maybe it was the VPN. Okay, well, somehow there's a prevention failure on the VPN. Now we have to go walk towards that stuff. So if you can keep following the prevention failures, you'll greatly secure your business moving forward. So I think that's a huge piece of that lesson learned is replaying how something happened. And that you can take that not just networks, but Office 365. Well, hey, we implemented multi-factor. How did they get in? Well, they used IMAP. IMAP was allowed to bypass the MFA controls, right? Oh, someone forgot to turn that off when we implemented multi-factor, right? Misconfigurations. So it's such a critical piece to enhancing the security posture of your organization moving forward.
Yeah, I think that was an excellent overview. The one thing that I will throw on here, and if you can't tell, I'm a huge, huge fan of this, is tabletop exercises. Is you can simulate almost all of these scenarios with enough time and effort, right? I mean, you got to focus on the big things to crack early, but as you start to do that, you can start to get better and better and more refined, and you can do other things such as, I'm going to do a tabletop exercise with the technical team, and I'm going to be incredibly technical. I can do a tabletop exercise with the communications team, and I can be very specific on communications. So you can intercept a ton of these kinds of things, and you're still applying all of those lessons learned and continuing to fuel your continuous improvement process, if you will.
I'll put in one note here. So those that are listening may or may not be technical. So typically tabletop exercises aren't that technical, depending on who the audience is, right? Typically it's a lot of business leaders or executives. For those that are technical and don't want to sit through who to contact and you want, more of a nitty gritty one, there's play.backdoorsandbreaches.com. So this is developed by Black Hills InfoSec out in South Dakota. They have a nice online version of their card game that you can go play. I've run through it with my own team saying, okay, great. Let's run through this technical deep dive incident. And whenever my senior incident response engineers chime in, I say, well, you're on vacation, you're on that cruise, you can't answer. Let's let the junior staff continue to learn.
Love it. Perfect. So it kind of wraps back around with having a plan and making sure to practice that plan. Thank you both for taking time, and definitely a topic I think we'll come back to in the future. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this topic, please let us know. Like, subscribe, or reach out to us at info@cit-net.com or head out to our website, cit-net.com/podcast. We'll be back next week with an all-new episode.